this has its moments, it has its advantages, has its disadvantages. And what I'm trying and do is to be as objective as I can. Now, I don't really believe in objectivity. We're all human beings. We all have highly individual and subjective perspectives, but I will do my level best to try and give you an objective account of what I learned in the last 9.5 years, and obviously what I knew about European integration prior to that. Now, let me begin with the proposition that I am older than European integration. European integration began in 1948, 49, and I've been around for a little longer than that. So I do have a temporal perspective. Obviously, I have a spatial perspective because I fly about Europe, between Budapest and Brussels and Strasbourg. And quite recently, we were in Lecce in southern Italy, Tallinn, Berlin. I mean, pretty much any European country you care to mention, I've probably visited in the last 4 or 5 years. I think I know every airport in Europe, or maybe there are 1 or 2 where I haven't got to yet. What I'm trying to suggest is that all these things necessarily have an impact on what I'm going to say, which actually I think is somewhat shocking in some respects, because I actually do believe that Europe is in the midst of a really very serious crisis indeed. We're at a crossroads, and it can go in various directions. I've no idea in which direction Europe will go, whether indeed there will be the kind of Europe that we have at the moment. It may be that radical change is in the offing, no means of telling. I don't have a crystal ball. But what I want to suggest to you is that at this moment, I can see 4 Europes, 4 concepts of Europe, 4 ways of understanding Europe. Now, the first one is what I call the technocratic Europe. This is the one driven by the Commission. It's the technocratic, legal, administrative instruments for advancing the integration of Europe. It's done quietly, very much in the background, and it has very little political consent. It has political consent via the member states, but very little directly. In other words, if you or anybody else, any European citizen, wanted to challenge the Commission politically, you'd find it extremely difficult to do so. In other words, what we have in Brussels is the accumulation of political power, because it is political power, as well as legal, administrative, technocratic, which is very difficult to challenge. So we're looking at this is a so-called democratic deficit, but it isn't just a democratic deficit, it's also a legitimacy deficit. And that, I think, is a very serious problem. Have a look, for example, at the debates and indeed the practical steps taken as far as economic governance is concerned. It's very technical, extremely difficult to understand, bank supervision, but basically it's being done at the elite level. It's very difficult for there to be a widespread public debate about it. What we do see, of course, is resistance to it, which is dismissed as populism, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Now, my second Europe is what I call human rights Europe. This is especially espoused by the left, and again the proposition is that human rights are everywhere, in all areas. Everything, in a sense, is potentially or actually governed by human rights. This has also been called the values empire. It is, again, elite-driven, and it has the problem, for me, that the values override facts. I encounter this quite regularly in the European Parliament, people who argue it's the spirit which counts, not the facts. Now, when one moves away, okay, I mean, I'm prepared to accept that every fact to some extent is context dependent, but still, some facts are real. And when people say the facts don't matter, it's the values that count, I see a collision. And that collision seems to me to have already produced the effect of sizable sections of society, and I'll try and argue as to why, are halfway or completely excluded from this, because it seems to me that the values empire goes counter to popular sovereignty. Without popular sovereignty, there is no democracy. In a sense, what I'm arguing is that there's a collision between human rights and democracy. Is democracy about the rule of the people, the entirety of the people, or actually actually are there human rights which transcend this? I'm simply raising it as a question, but I think it's a question to which I have my own answer, which is that we do have to think more seriously about popular sovereignty, and in certain circumstances accept that human rights may have to be subjected to a derogation. My third Europe is really the anti-Europe. It's the antithesis, which is supported by the radical right, the people we call populists, and the radical left, people we call extremists. But this is the mainstream definition. In other words, the mainstream, the elites, I'm talking about the European elites, are saying we are being challenged from both left and right, and we argue that this challenge is illegitimate, which, by the way, in the context of the Europe that has come into being, it is illegitimate, because it challenges that Europe from perspectives which are very uncomfortable. But it seems to me that when you have sizable sections of the population, maybe as high as 50% in France from both left and right, who say, we do not accept what the mainstream parties are saying. We want a different kind of Europe, whether it's left or right. When I was in London in the summer, I went with the European Parliament's Constitutional Commission. One of the people we met said, I'm a left-wing Eurosceptic. So it's not just a right-wing perspective, it's also a left-wing perspective. If you read or listen to what my parliamentary colleague, whom I've never met, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, says, you get a very similar perspective. He's a left-wing anti-European. Anti-European in the sense that the European elites define this. There are particular issues that this radicalism espouses. I think the central, what is the problem of globalization? They reject globalization. Now, in a way that's like saying, I reject the weather. There's nothing to be done about globalization. It's a reality. It's one of these realities that, in a sense, there's not much we can do about it, but there are some measures that we can take, and these measures, it seems to me, would almost certainly help the losers of globalization, who are many, to come to terms with what is actually happening. And the losers of globalization, for example, probably 20% of the European labour force have been put out of work because their skills are too low to compete with China, or Indonesia, or Vietnam, or wherever. What do? These are citizens. They have full rights. But economically, if you look at it from a market perspective, they're worthless. I think this is an intolerable situation. And this is what I think is being seized on by both far right and far left, to say these are also citizens, etc., etc. The mainstream says the market will sort it out. I don't myself believe this. I don't believe that the market resolves everything, but then, we can certainly argue about this. The fourth Europe is what I call the Europe of equal status, the parity of esteem. If you go back to the foundations, you will remember there were 6 founding members of the European Union, large states and small states, and I think one of the key issues, a silent one to some extent, was that each and every member state enjoyed equality of treatment from the others. Intervention in the internal affairs of member states had to go through very particular procedures. To some degree, they're still there. But what I do see is the readiness on the part of some actors to intervene in the internal affairs of member states on the basis of human rights rather than necessarily the legality, the legal system of the European Union. So what I sense is that this Europe of equal status hasn't disappeared, but it is weakening. And I think that without the equal status, the parity of esteem, the consent, the popular consent to European integration will be in great trouble, may possibly founder, but more likely actually stagnate. Now, as I've suggested, all these Europes, the 4 Europes that I've tried to define, are exposed to globalization, security threats, energy problems, migratory pressure, and I think what the most important is that the European Union as a process is probably the most effective instrument of conflict resolution that Europe has ever devised. Again, because I'm older than European integration, I remember very faintly, because I was quite small at the time, the founding fathers were all saying, and by the way, there were no founding mothers, or obviously the wives of the founding fathers of the moment of significance, were saying there must never be another war between France and Germany. There were people alive in 1945 who lived through three: Franco-Prussian War, First World War, Second World War. I'm just old enough to have lived through the Second World War. Now, that is something of the past. The idea of another war in Europe is inconceivable. And some of you will remember how utterly shocked people were in the West in the wars of Yugoslav succession. So